My session looks at immoral. Is the Bible immoral? And the issue of the Canaanites. Karen will then come and think about, is it out of date? All scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. So reads 2 Timothy 3:16, a verse familiar and dear, no doubt, to many here. And it says two things primarily about scripture. One, that it's God-breathed. A huge amount has been written on that, and I'm not going to go into that today. And secondly, that it is useful for both belief and lifestyle. And that's the focus of this morning, that the Bible is useful. And this applies to all of it. All scripture is useful. Now, having said that, in wider society, the idea of using the Bible, or indeed any holy book, for defining or even guiding how people should believe and live would be, for many, truly bizarre. They would see the Bible as irrelevant, out of date, and certainly for some passages, frankly, immoral. Not the kind of thing you should use for determining your morality. Not something to base your belief and lifestyle upon. One extreme example, of course, would be the good old New Atheist, and Richard Dawkins, always good for a quick quote if you want to attack Christianity. He has a chapter in the Bible in his book, The God Delusion. And his main question is how on earth people can claim that they get their morality, their system of values, from the Bible. He sees this as ludicrous. So a couple of choice Dawkinsian quotes here. Those who wish to base their morality literally on the Bible have either not read it or do not understand it. Do those people who hold up the Bible as an inspiration to moral rectitude have the slightest notion of what is actually written in it? And sorry, the references have dropped off some. That's not very good for a lecturer. That's pages 269 and 281. Now, our instinctive reaction might be to dismiss what he's saying, and there are any number of points in his book that should be dismissed. However, before we do that in this case, we need to ask ourselves the hard question. Are there passages in the Bible that at least seem to raise moral concerns and problems? And assuming there are some, we have to then ask, so how do these passages how are these passages useful in helping me to think how to live and what to believe? And by the way, admitting there are passages in the Bible that you find difficult does not make you a bad Christian. I teach Old Testament, I love the Bible as the Word of God, and I find passages difficult, and so do many others. So, it's not just you. Pride of place among these morally difficult passages is arguably given to the passages about the conquest of Canaan. For example, let's just read Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 to 2. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittite, the Girgashite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, 7 nations greater and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. God commands Israel to go into the land and utterly destroy a nation, men, women and children, showing them no mercy and seizing their land. Isn't that immoral? Or at least doesn't it raise certain moral questions? For example, if we read of that in any other context, wouldn't we condemn it as genocide? Utterly immoral. See, for the new atheists, this is the morality of religion, whether it's the conquest of Canaan, the Crusades, 9/11, or whatever. Proof that religion is bad for you, or probably bad for someone else, and definitely should not be the basis of morals. Thus, not surprisingly, Dawkins seizes on these passages to support his point. Saying this, the point is that whether true or not, the Bible is held up to us as the source of our morality. And the Bible's story of Joshua's destruction of Jericho and the invasion of the Promised Land in general is morally indistinguishable from Hitler's invasion of Poland or Saddam Hussein's massacres of the Kurds and the Marsh Arabs. The Bible may be an arresting and poetic work of fiction, but it is not the sort of book you should give your children to form their morals. How do we respond to that? Well, on the grounds that we would want to use it in some way, how do we use it? Presumably, we wouldn't want to give it to our children by saying, well, little Johnny, whoever, Joshua and the Israelites went into a land and slaughtered all of them, so you should do the same thing. That would, if we did that, then Dawkins would have a very good point. This would be the ultimate example of why we don't use, or we shouldn't use, some people do, but we shouldn't use what you might call a monkey see, monkey do school of interpretation. If there's a good Bible character and they do something, then we should uncritically do it too. That's far too simplistic. If that's too simplistic, then how do we read and use these texts as part of Scripture, which is God-breathed and useful. How do we read the Bible well? And that's a key element of what we teach here at BBC, helping our students to interpret and read the Bible better. And there are various principles involved in good interpretation. And one of them, one really important one, is to read the Bible and passages within the Bible in context. And that's what we're going to do this morning. Specifically, we're going to look at the conquest text in their wider biblical context. There are various contexts. Karen will look at a different one, but we're going to look at the wider biblical context and see how these texts relate to the wider portrayal of God in the Bible. Because the overall picture of God in the Bible is a God who loves his creation, both humanity and the wider world, and seeks their good. One way to understand the Bible is as the great story of God's dealings and relationship with his world. The great redemption of the world. And one key passage for understanding that is the promise that God makes to Abraham and the patriarchs. Putting it in context, after God's created a perfect world, humanity has ruined it by turning away from God. God starts his rescue plan with one man, Abraham. And in Genesis 12, God says to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. I'll make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the peoples of the earth shall be blessed." And we can follow these promises throughout the biblical story, as God gives Abraham descendants, the nation of Israel, and the land, and ultimately we see blessing to all peoples on earth through Christ, explicitly picked up in the New Testament. But again, this raises the question, so how do the Canaanites fit into this? Because an integral part of God's plan of salvation is Canaan, which is called the promised land. It's part of the promises. And Canaan already has occupants. For Israel to receive the blessing and all families to receive the blessing, it seems that the Canaanites must receive the opposite, destruction. How do we hold these points together? How do we hold together Genesis 12, all families will be blessed, and Deuteronomy 7, wipe them out? To answer this, we're going to look at the biblical portrayal of the Canaanites. How do they fit into the biblical story? How they're described, the reasons given for why Israel should do what they're going to do, and then try and get a big picture of how it fits, how wider biblical context can help us to understand. Now, I'm not the only person struggling with and writing on this issue. There are other much bigger names out there. If you want to read more, here's a couple of suggestions. Chris Wright, local boy, Old Testament theologian, good chap, written a book called The God I Don't Understand. And two of the chapters in this are grappling with the issue of the Canaanites. He also grapples with the question of evil generally, the cross, and the end of the world, all in less than 200 pages. Does it in an accessible way and helpful. He also looks at wider biblical context in a different way than I'm doing. If you want something more complex, more detailed, then Copeland and Flanagan have written the book Did God Really Command Genocide?, focusing purely on this issue. A very apologetic, punchy, detailed discussion of both philosophical issues and biblical context. This morning, I'm not going to look at these, not because I think I'm better, but because this is a lecture about what I'm doing and showing what we do here, and this is my small contribution to this larger debate, the issue of the portrayal of the Canaanites. And I'm going to do this under four headings. Look at four ways to possibly describe the Canaanites in Scripture, the biblical portrayal of the Canaanites. Canaanites as sinners, Canaanites as danger, Canaanites as warning, and Canaanites as challenge. And each term builds up a more detailed, nuanced picture. If you want more details on this, what I'm saying today is based on an article I've written, and I humbly refer you to the college website. There's a link at the bottom of the end of your handout, along with details of the two books I've just mentioned. Alternatively, please ask questions either in the question session or the coffee break. So that's what we're doing. Let's move on to our first heading. Canaanites as sinners. Is that the way we should describe the Canaanites? Because the first real evaluation of the Canaanites, the first reason for the conquest, comes in Genesis 15, verse 16. God has already promised the land to Abraham's descendants in chapter 12. Now he tells Abraham that his descendants will return to the land in the fourth generation. For the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. Amorites is another way of referring to the nations as a whole. I'm talking using Canaanites normally, the nations in the land. So the first reason given is that they're sinners. However, they're not yet bad enough sinners to lose the land, and they will not be so for 400 years. Note the implication here. God cares about the actions of the Canaanites. He's not just going to get rid of them, this is my man, I'm going to wipe this lot away and give him the land now. Rather, Abraham and his descendants must wait, including, in verse 13, a period of oppression in Egypt. They must wait until the Canaanites have gone too far. The actions of the Canaanites make a difference to God. He isn't just God of Israel, he's God of the whole world, including the Canaanites. Now, this passage doesn't go into detail about what the sin of the Canaanites actually is, but later passages do. And these passages focus on one area in particular, their religious practices, which are described as abominable or detestable in the eyes of God. Other areas, other sins such as oppression, murder, arrogance, and so on, aren't mentioned. And they are mentioned in oracles against other surrounding nations. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Canaanites didn't do any of those things. Of course they did. I'm simply noting the Bible doesn't focus on them or make them the reason. The reason is their religious practices. That's what they're held to account for. Beyond a brief mention of sexual sins in Leviticus, the focus is religious. And this raises a question. The Canaanites, after all, were not the only nation whose religious practices were offensive to God. We have other descriptions of such elsewhere in the Bible. So why, therefore, were the Canaanites judged and destroyed from the land, while other nations did not receive the same focus and judgment? One sort of popular apologetic answer you may have come across is to say, well, the Canaanites were far worse. They were the worst sinners ever, far worse than the other nations, at least far worse idolaters. Trouble is, the biblical portrayal doesn't bear this out. The most negative portrayal of the Canaanites is Deuteronomy 12:31, which states, every abominable thing that God hates, they have done for their gods. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Now, to say that they commit every abominable act is pretty negative, but the specific reason given, and presumably the worst thing, you're not going to say something that's, if there's worse things, this is the worst thing, child sacrifice. Well, child sacrifice would be utterly detestable to us, the worst form of child abuse. But in the culture of the time, we know that it was not unique. Others, apart from the Canaanites, did it. We read of Mesha of Moab in 2 Kings 3, and we know from extra-biblical sources that this was practiced elsewhere, even sometimes within Israel. If this is the worst practice of the Canaanites, and other nations carried it out, then the Canaanites are not obviously worse in their religious practices than other nations. A better reason to the question, so why focus on the Canaanites, is that to note that the concept of judgment for their sins is not the main reason given for the conquest. There is another, much more common reason given, that the Canaanites are a danger to Israel. So we turn now to our second term, Canaanites as danger. And this image adds a key component to the portrayal of the Canaanites in the Bible. It adds the concept of Israel, because after all, the Old Testament is Israel's scriptures. The outworking of God's promises in the Old Testament is primarily through Israel before it becomes global through Christ. The major reason for the mention of the Canaanites in the Old Testament is how they interact with Israel. Therefore, we have to take Israel into consideration when we're looking at the biblical portrayal of the Canaanites. To put it another way, my little diagram at the bottom, Canaanites as sinners suggests a relationship purely between God and the Canaanites. Canaanites as danger acknowledges the more complex relationship with God, Israel, and the Canaanites. The divine commands are not given directly to the Canaanites. You must be destroyed because you are sinners. Rather, they're given to Israel. God tells Israel that either he is destroying the Canaanites or Israel must destroy them because they are a danger. What sort of danger? Well, the Israelites think it's military, but they're wrong. 10 of the 12 spies, in the story of Numbers 13, when they go and spy out the land, 10 of the 12 come back and bring word of the strong Canaanites in their fortified cities. And the people reject Moses and Aaron and want to go back to Egypt, say they can't do it. 2 of the spies, of course, bring the right message. Yes, the Canaanites are strong, say Joshua and Caleb, but because God is with us, we can beat them. And this is picked up again in Deuteronomy chapter 2, in this very sermonic style that it has. If you fear the Canaanites, you're disregarding God. With God, the Canaanites will be beaten. Don't fear the Canaanites is the message. Fear God. Because the real danger of the Canaanites to Israel is not military but religious. If God is with Israel, the Canaanites will be defeated. However, once this has happened, Israel are warned that they must not be tempted to follow the gods and religious practices of the Canaanites, because this would mean turning away from or compromising their faith in God, their relationship with God. And this warning occurs in nearly all of the divine messages about the Canaanites before the conquest. There's a few there. It's described as a snare for Israel and something that will lead to their destruction. This is serious stuff. And it's in this context of extreme danger that God commands the destruction of the Canaanites. Israel must do whatever it takes to avoid compromising their faith, to avoid idolatry. And this explains the focus on the Canaanites rather than on the nations. The Canaanites are the focus of the divine commands because they're the greatest danger for Israel. Not because they're worse than all the other nations, but rather because they are the people, the idolaters, who Israel are most likely to encounter, because they're the ones in the land. It's their location that makes them a particular danger. And by the way, this brings up another point, just a peripheral point slightly, but important in terms of thinking. This was a one-off event, a one-off local event. The commands to destroy the Canaanites only relate to the people living in the land at the time of the conquest. Now, that doesn't solve the problems. Even once it's problematic. But it does mean that we can say that, with the minor exception of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, Israel is not ever told later to do the same thing to others. This is not the general ethic of how you relate to other nations in the Bible. The Bible does not say that we should practice this. Reading it that way would be indiscriminate. People have done it, they've got it wrong, they've misread it, but it's not appropriate. This is not how God tells people to act on an ongoing basis. So now we have two reasons for the commands. The Canaanites are sinners and the Canaanites are a danger, and of course these are linked. The Canaanites are a danger because they're sinners and because they might lead Israel into sin. And the combination of reasons is why they need to be destroyed from the land. But even with both these together, there's still a problem here. They're both focusing on the Canaanites as different from Israel and negatively different. And this could have the effect of portraying them as completely negative, in effect dehumanizing them, demonizing them. You imagine the kind of concept, destroy them because they're religiously different and therefore dangerous, sounds like the worst kind of xenophobia. But that isn't what the Bible is saying. Not only that, this is too simple. Again, we have to keep going. To get a better picture, let's move on to another term. Canaanites as warning. You see, the Bible does not portray the Canaanites as totally different from the Israelites. There are some important similarities between them. The most obvious similarity is the land. The Canaanites are the ones who were in the land before Israel. However, God destroyed them from the land because of their practices, primarily religious ones. Israel are warned of the danger of the Canaanites, the danger of following their religious practices, and the consequences of this, being destroyed from the land. I mean, after all, in the end, it is not Israel's land. It is the Lord's land. Israel are living there, if you like, as his tenants, just as the Canaanites were. The tenancy agreement in the case of Israel is the Sinai covenant, with conditions for Israel, primarily loyalty to God, the first commandment, and so forth. If Israel break this tenancy agreement, the Sinai covenant, well, they can be evicted, just like the Canaanites were before them. In other words, the Canaanites are an example and a warning to Israel of the consequences of idolatry. If Israel act like the Canaanites, then they will be treated like them. And this link is made explicit in several places, the strongest of which is in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 19 to 20. And God says through Moses, "If you surely forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and bow down to them, I testify concerning you today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations which the Lord is destroying before you, thus you will be destroyed because you would not listen to the voice of the Lord your God. Putting this passage in its immediate context, it comes immediately after chapter 7, with the warning they must destroy the religious practices and the warning of destruction of Israel if they don't. After that comes chapter 8, which is a chapter about the need to remember God in times of prosperity as well as disaster, and here those verses warn against the danger of not remembering God. Straight after this, chapter 9 starts with a reminder to Israel not to be afraid of the Canaanites who are stronger than they are, because God will defeat them. And then in verses 4 to 6 it carries on like this. When the Lord your God thrusts them, the Canaanites, out before you, do not say to yourself, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to occupy this land. It is rather because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. It is not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you're going in to occupy their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is dispossessing them before you, in order to fulfill the promise that the Lord made on oath to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Know then that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to occupy because of your righteousness, for you are a stiff-necked people. And here God is expanding on the reasons why Israel are entering the land and warning them, pricking the bubble, preempting any misunderstanding by Israel that in some way they deserve the land. They've earned it. They're special. They're different from they're morally, intrinsically more righteous than the Canaanites are, who God is driving out. And 3 times he denies this. 3 times he rejects any idea that the land is given because of Israel's righteousness. Repetition shows something important in the Bible. That's not the reason. There are 2 reasons why the nations are being driven out. One of them, repeated in verses 4 and 5, is, we've already seen it, the wickedness of the nations, that they are sinners. The other reason, again we've seen it, the patriarchal promises. In verse 5, God promised the land to Abraham's descendants. However, Israel need to be careful. They've just been warned in 8:19 to 20 that if they act like the Canaanites, they will be treated like them. Now God is telling them they shouldn't uncritically distinguish themselves from the Canaanites. We're so different from them. The Canaanites acted wickedly, yes, but Israel are stiff-necked. And just to ram this point home, the next chapter pretty much, chapter 9 verse 7 to 10, 11, is an extended reminder of the prime example of Israel's stiff-neckedness, the episode of the golden calf, where Israel broke the newly formed covenant by idolatry and were on the point of being destroyed as a nation, except for Moses' intercession. Put all of this together as part of Deuteronomy's sermonic exhortation. This part of Deuteronomy is trying to tell them, you need to follow God, you need to follow his laws, his teachings. This comparison becomes a strong warning. Israel must not follow the idolatry of the Canaanites or be destroyed, chapter 7. They'll be destroyed like the Canaanites, chapter 8. Israel are not intrinsically better than the Canaanites, and they've proven that they can be idolaters at the carven calf. To put it another way, the danger of the Canaanites is not only in their physical proximity to Israel, they're in the land, the idolaters Israel's going to meet, but also in their moral proximity. Israel can become like them. The one significant difference for the Bible between Israel and the Canaanites is Israel's covenant relationship with God, which is based, of course, on these patriarchal promises. That's the reason why Israel have the land or are going to get it. If Israel break or ignore this covenant, then they will become, in effect, Canaanites and will be treated like them. The Canaanites, if you like, are a mirror to Israel of what they would be like without their relationship with God. The later history of Israel and the land bears this out. Several times in the book of Kings, for example, the nation or its king is explicitly compared to the nations beforehand. So in 1 Kings 14, Rehoboam's Judah provoked the Lord to jealousy with their religious practices. Quote, they committed all the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. Now the mention of the Lord driving out the nations is an implicit warning here. Look guys, you're doing what they did. God drove them out because of it. Therefore, a similar comparison is made with kings Ahab and Ahaz, both of whom are notorious for importing foreign worship and are described as going after idols in the case of Ahab, and child sacrifice in the case of Ahaz, like the nations. In 2 Kings 17, the fall of the northern kingdom, the detailed reason given contains two explicit comparisons with the Canaanites. And finally, just the top of the bill, there's the indictment of King Manasseh of Judah, that he led Judah astray to do more evil than the nations who had done, whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. Not only is Israel being compared here, they're worse than the Canaanites under Manasseh. They have utterly rejected God and the covenant, the one thing that makes them different, the reason they're in the land, and this is the point at which God declares exile for Judah in that passage, 1 Kings 21. By acting just like, or indeed worse than the Canaanites, Israel and Judah have become like them, and they will be treated like them, just as the northern kingdom was before them. Now at this point, we might want to raise an objection and say, well, okay, Deuteronomy 8 said that if the Israelites acted like the Canaanites, they'd be treated just like them, destroyed just like them. Well, okay, we can see that Israel have acted like them, but have they really been destroyed like them? I mean, they're being exiled, not very nice, but Deuteronomy speaks about destruction. Is exile destruction? How do we link? Is this not quite the same? Well, to do that, we need to think about what Deuteronomy means when it uses the terms destruction, destroy. And there's a detail, useful. I'm not suggesting you read this, or you're welcome to do so. We've got it in the library, but it's quite detailed. A recent book by Turner looks at Deuteronomy's theology of exile. And he notes that when Deuteronomy speaks about exile for Israel, it doesn't use the normal Hebrew verbs for exile. There's some that we expect to see. You see them elsewhere in the Old Testament. Instead, Deuteronomy uses far stronger verbs, in particular two verbs, shamad and avad, which are normally used to mean destroy, or to be destroyed. So Deuteronomy is using verbs of destruction to refer to exile. This is hyperbole, a literary device exaggerating for effect. And this is not unique in the Bible. We find hyperbole elsewhere. Classically, the words of Jesus. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. I mean, we don't take that literally, do we? I'm guessing nobody here does. At the risk of being in bad taste, if you do take it literally, raise your right hand. Sorry. It's exaggerating to make a point that anything that causes us to sin, however dear to us, even as dear as our right hand, needs to be disposed of. Returning to Deuteronomy, in this case, the point is to explain the consequences of exile for Israel. You see, for Israel as a nation, exile means the death of the nation, the destruction of the nation. It no longer exists. The people do, but the nation doesn't. The nation would be dead. And we look elsewhere in the Old Testament, we can see that people saw it that way. Most classically, probably in Ezekiel 37, the famous, them bones, dry, the valley of dry bones vision. But dry bones come back to life in a kind of really reverse rotting process. And it's described explicitly as referring to the return to the land. It's like resurrection from the dead, Judah coming back to the land. That's how important it is. So what? What does it mean for the Canaanites? Well, if Israel are to be destroyed like the nations, and for Israel this means exile, the death of the nation as a nation in the land, the destruction of the nation, well, for this comparison to make sense, it suggests that when the Deuteronomy speaks of the nation as being destroyed before God, or Israel, then this should also be understood as the equivalent of exile. The nation's being driven out, and that's a verb that's used elsewhere in Exodus, in Deuteronomy itself. These two verbs use destroy and drive out. We can understand them both in the same way. They are being driven out and destroyed as a functioning nation. Israel has to ensure the Canaanites are destroyed as functioning religious entities in the land that they are in. That does not require the death of every single Canaanite. And we know that in the exile of Judah to Babylon, many Judean peasants were left in the land, even though the nation ceased to exist. We know from elsewhere in the Old Testament that there are any number of Canaanites left in the land after the conquest. Israel needs to do whatever is necessary to avoid the religious danger of the Canaanites. It doesn't need to do more than that. And this links back to the previous one. Why are the Canaanites the danger? Because they're in the land. Therefore, Israel is like to encounter them. If they're no longer in the land, therefore, logically, they're no longer a danger, or at least no more a danger than any other nation worshipping other gods and other practices. They're also a warning to Israel that committing idolatry will lead to losing the land. The land is part of the covenant. Israel break the covenant, they lose the land. And the later history with these comparisons shows that when Israel became as bad as or worse than the Canaanites, they did lose the land. Again, the one difference is that Israel and Judah are returned to the land after the exile. But the Bible is pretty clear on this. This is not due to their righteousness. It's due to God. God returns them in his mercy. They didn't deserve to return, just as they don't deserve to get the land in the first place, as Deuteronomy 9 makes very clear. Okay, so another possible objection. Someone might say, well, okay, maybe say Deuteronomy, the commands are expressing drive out, not necessarily kill everyone, but what about Joshua? What about those passages in Joshua that seem to show Joshua and the Israelites really killing everyone who breathes? Good question. Here's an example verse for you, Joshua chapter 10, verse 40. So Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country and the Negev, the lowland and the slopes and all their kings. He left no one remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded. Now that does sound like killing everyone, doesn't it? But having said that, a few chapters on, after the conquest, when Joshua started to allocate the land, God speaks to him and says this: "You are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be possessed." Now, if very much of the land still remains to be possessed, this presumably means that lots of the land is still held by the Canaanites. Therefore, Israel obviously hasn't wiped them all out. And in the rest of Joshua and the beginning of the book of Judges, we see that Israel has mixed success at best in even driving out the Canaanites. What does that mean for a passage like Joshua 10:40? How do we understand this? Well, this is another example of hyperbole. And this isn't just wishful thinking, we know this. We know this because of the type of material, the genre of material that we have in Joshua 6 to 12, the main conquest accounts. See, understanding the genre of a passage is another fundamentally important point when interpreting the Bible. And Joshua 6 to 12 is what we might call war journal genre. Scholars have found other examples of war journals from the ancient Near East, Syrian, Hittite, Egyptian, for example, which have strong similarities to parts of Joshua 6 to 12. And these other accounts use hyperbole. We know they're hyperbolic when they're describing the results of battles, so that a comprehensive victory is portrayed as a total slaughter of the entire enemy group. It's propaganda. Don't mess with us, we'll wipe you out, we'll wipe your family out, and so on. It's effective, especially for the Syrians. Now, we might wince at this and feel, well, it's a bit unhistorical, isn't it? Frankly, isn't it lying? Not something we see the Bible saying. But again, that would be misunderstanding the genre. Let me give you a light-hearted contemporary illustration. You may have heard this before. Suppose I was telling you about a football game that I played last weekend. Don't laugh. Just imagine, and I'm saying, we really slaughtered the opposition. Now, what would you understand by that statement? Would you get very worried and immediately call the police or rush to the field and expect to see body parts strewn everywhere? Presumably not. You know what I mean, that we scored considerably more goals than them, and we therefore won the game comprehensively. We beat them, even beat them, it sounds like, we're not actually thrashing them. Am I lying there if I say we slaughtered them? No, I'm not, because you and I both know the code, we know the genre, we know the idiom. Now, if there was someone who knew nothing about football, if that's possible, and didn't know this kind of phraseology, and they overheard us speaking, they might well be concerned. But that would be misunderstanding. Just as someone would be misunderstanding Jesus if they thought they actually had to cut their right hand off, and misunderstanding this passage if we don't understand the hyperbole. It's a silly example of football, but it does show the importance of understanding genre and how we read passages. And with this, we can return to Joshua 10 and realise that the southern campaign that Joshua 10 is talking about, and that verse is summarising, and the northern campaign in Joshua 11 are actually best understood as stunningly successful raids, where Israel disable and destroy the key Canaanite military infrastructure, which would be a significant threat to them. Not necessarily wiping out entire nations. Therefore, on the one hand, we can regard the commands in Deuteronomy to destroy the Canaanites, and also the outworking of the commands in Joshua and Judges, as primarily focused on getting rid of the Canaanites as a religious danger, whatever that meant. We don't have to read them as genocide as destroying every living soul. That doesn't mean there wouldn't have been death. Let's not, sugarcoat this. There would have been. Presumably also including non-competence. It's not pretty. It's not nice. I'm not trying to make it nice. We're trying to find out what it's really saying. And therefore we can also know that Deuteronomy 8 is correct. When the Israelites acted like the Canaanites, they were destroyed like the Canaanites, destroyed as a nation in the land. The Canaanites were a warning to Israel, which Israel sadly failed to heed. Well, so far the Canaanites have still come across pretty negatively, haven't they? Even if Israel can be as bad as them, even if Israel can be treated like them, we can still ask the question, what about the Canaanites? Do they fit into God's great plan of salvation in any way other than as a warning, a symbol of those who aren't in a relationship with God? Is there any place in the blessing of all nations that we see in Genesis 12, is there any place for the Canaanites? Can they be blessed through Abraham too? And this is where we come to our fourth and final term, the Canaanites as challenge. Because the Bible does not present the Canaanites in a totally negative light. The passages we've been looking at, the negative ones, refer to the Canaanites as a whole, the group, the Canaanites, undifferentiated. Laws, challenges to Israel when they're outside the land. However, there are also stories of Israel's encounter with individual Canaanites, which give us a much more positive picture. We've already mentioned the records of the campaigns in Joshua 10 to 12. However, before these general campaigns, which are summarised, we get much more detailed pictures of the attacks on three cities, Jericho, Ai, and Gibeon. And the focus here is not on wiping out the Canaanites, although the verbs are used. Rather, the focus is on three individuals or groups: the Canaanite Rahab, the Israelite Achan, and the Canaanite Gibeonites. Let's see what happens when Israel encounters these folks. In Joshua 2, we encounter Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute. Two Israelite spies are sent to stay with her, and she hides them from her own people in defiance of her king and at the risk of her own life. Why would she do this? Well, she explains in chapter 2, verses 9 to 11. She says, "I know the Lord has given you the land, and that dread of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea, how you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed." There's that verb again. "As soon as we heard it, our hearts failed, and there was no courage left in any of us because of you. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." In summary, she's heard of what God has done. In fact, they've all heard what God has done. This is how she is responding to it. She recognises that he is God. Her confession there in verse 11, "The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below," is the greatest confession of God in the whole book of Joshua. And ironically, not by an Israelite, but by a Canaanite. Her response to this understanding of this God is to side with him and his people. As a result, in chapter 6, she and her family are explicitly spared from the attack on Jericho and live within Israel to this day. There is one other group of Canaanites who act the same way to Rahab. In chapter 9, the Gibeonites hear of what God has done similarly. Rather than siding with all the rest of the Canaanites who are forming a league against Israel, they want to side with Israel. Now, they know that Israel is not going to make a covenant with any nation in the land, so they trick them. They trick them in one thing in particular, where they live. As a result, Israel make a covenant of peace with them, and they even uphold it when they realise where the Gibeonites really live, because they swore by the Lord. The Gibeonites give similar reasons to Rahab for siding with Israel and their God. They've heard of God's acts in Egypt and across the Jordan, and they know that he'd given the land to Egypt. Now, because of their deception, they're made servants, hewers of wood and drawers of water, in that wonderful phrase, but hewers of wood and drawers of water for the shrine of God. They, like Rahab, are effectively becoming part of Israel. In both cases, Canaanites come to Israel seeking to ally with Israel's God because of their God. They want to ally, in other words, they want to follow this God. In both cases, they are accepted. These are the only two examples of Canaanites in the conquest who come to Israel and seek to side with Israel. Everyone else rejects them and opposes them. Therefore, we can say that in the story of the conquest, any Canaanite who seeks to side with Israel and God is accepted. No matter how they do it, the Canaanites are not doomed to destruction. All of them have heard the same things, what God has done. The difference is how they respond to that knowledge, how they respond to this God. Their treatment depends upon how they respond to God. And this is the inverse of Israel's position. Israel, God's chosen people, must not follow the gods of the Canaanites. If they do, they'll become, in effect, like the Canaanites and be treated like them. And this is illustrated clearly in the story that comes between Rahab and the Gibeonites, the story of the Israelite Achan. Achan disobeys God's command, takes plunder from Jericho, thus associating himself with Jericho. As a result, he becomes like Jericho and is destroyed from Israel. The Israelite is treated like the Canaanites. However, Rahab and the Gibeonites show the converse of this. Canaanites who side with Israel can become Israel and be treated like them. And the placement of Achan between Rahab and the Gibeonites makes that link explicit. There are strong literary links between the passages. It's making the point, this is a contrast, a deliberate contrast. What matters in the end is not your ethnicity, but how you respond to God. So even Canaanites under sentence of destruction can avoid that destruction. Those who as a group are a warning to Israel of the dangers of idolatry can actually be held up as examples of lived out faith in God. And Rahab is the key example. 2 places in the New Testament she's held up as an example of lived out faith. She is the last detailed example in the great by faith chapter in Hebrews 11. She's also mentioned in James 2, one of 2 examples of how the people who lived out their faith. The other example is Abraham. Not bad company for a Canaanite prostitute. And it's not surprising that the early church often used Rahab as the example of the ideal Gentile convert. She's also mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, the start of the New Testament. Rahab the Canaanite is part of the promised line that leads from Abraham through David to Jesus. And she's not the only one. Not the only Canaanite. The first woman mentioned, Tamar, in verse 3, is the Canaanite daughter-in-law of Judah, who Judah, in the story of Genesis 38, confirms is more righteous than he is. The fourth woman mentioned, Bathsheba, is described as the wife of Uriah. Uriah is a Hittite, one of the Canaanite groups. Uriah, we know from the story in 2 Samuel 11, acts more righteously than the Israelite King David does. And there's more. Melchizedek, the priest king of Salem, is a Canaanite city. Therefore, presumably, he is a Canaanite. He blesses Abraham. Abraham gives him a tenth of everything. And Hebrews calls Jesus a priest in the order of Melchizedek. A Canaanite woman comes to Jesus in Matthew 15, and although the passage is difficult, it ends with Jesus commending her faith. Woman, great is your faith. These are not examples of how not to live. Examples of the danger of turning away from God. Rather, they're examples of honouring God that should be followed. Instead of being a danger to God's salvation, as expressed through the promises, they're examples of it. They contribute to it. Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek and the descendant of Rahab, Tamar, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Again, these show that the Canaanites are not simply a race doomed to destruction, even the lesser destruction of being destroyed from the land. The Bible shows that anyone who chooses to respond positively to the God of Israel will be treated like Israel. Anyone. Even in some cases, being brought into the patriarchal promises and held up as an example of faith. So, the Canaanites are not simply a warning to Israel, that's too negative. Rather, they're a challenge to Israel. The betrayal of the Canaanites as a whole is the negative side of the challenge. The warning. This is what Israel will be like. This is what you will be like without your relationship with God. If you act like them, you'll be treated like them. The portrayal of the Canaanites as individuals contains the positive challenge. There are some Canaanites whose response to God is an inspiration, an example to be followed. And in both cases, the key factor is how people respond to God. Be they Israelite or Canaanite, believer or unbeliever. Very briefly, and you'll be glad to hear this in conclusion, returning to the question of how the portrayal of the Canaanites fits into the wider biblical story and message. Seeing the Canaanites as challenge, I think is the best term, resonates well with the wider Bible and challenges us as contemporary readers in a way that I would say is both moral and useful. On the one hand, the negative challenge demonstrates the requirement of loyalty to God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. You shall have no other gods before me. Central key concept. Whatever that means, whatever cost that means to myself, we must do whatever is necessary to ensure that that is true for us. On the other hand, the positive challenge shows the hope for all, whoever they are. And this is also a challenge for us. Let us never subconsciously write off anyone, any person, any group as somehow beyond God's mercy, irredeemable, too bad. Nobody is that bad. How dare we even unconsciously do that? Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Even Canaanites. Thank you. So, you've listened very patiently. I'm sure there are some questions out there, so I think we have a roving mic somewhere. So if you want to raise a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone over and ask. Well, here we have. We'll start with.
Thank you, William. That was very insightful. Thank you so much. I just have a couple of questions about the thorny subject of history. I've read a couple of books recently, I'm sure you're familiar with them, Walter Moberly and Catherine Dell, who both kind of tried to defend the Old Testament in various ways. They make a distinction between the world within the text and the world outside the text. And just in terms of your overall approach, you didn't kind of you didn't talk about Joshua and Deuteronomy and the historical background of these texts when they were produced. What message you thought they were trying to convey in their own time. And just wondering, it kind of you did this, I suppose, to a certain degree with the idea of the war journal genre. And just perhaps can we create some kind of a distance between what this text was intended to say at its own time and the historical events that they report. Could that be another helpful way to help us get around some of the thornier issues?
It can, thank you. Yes, the historical background. One reason why I didn't touch on it is because Karen's going to do stuff on historical background in her talk, so I thought I'd cover a different kind of interpretive approach. We can certainly say things. There's, well, we're not wanting to get into some of the minutiae of Old Testament scholarship, but there's various debates about exactly when it was produced and exactly what it would be for and so forth. But some people have linked, some of the importance to Josiah's reforms and say how this is kind of showing how important Josiah's reforms were. Again, some scholars will take it in different ways, but that'd be one way to do it. What's Joshua trying to do? There's other books about, how is Joshua trying to explain to Israel who they are as a community? Is it about identity forming? And if it is, then these interesting points about identity is not rock solid. It's not sort of monolithically ethnic. Achan can lose identity, Rahab and the Canaanites can gain it. So what does it mean to be, part of Israel at the time? And therefore, again, we can continue that through. What does it mean to be part of the community of faith now? Tricky. I mean, it is because you have to then, there is a difference between saying, okay, the situation then is different from the situation now. And again, I'll leave that more to Karen to talk about more in detail. I don't want to steal her thunder. But yes, so there are approaches, there are things that can be said.
Just another follow-up?
Yeah, just quickly, I suppose.
It's just that, what about someone like Peter Enns that would go even further and say that this did not happen? We have other explanations of how the Israelites emerged within the land, and can that be another way to get us out of this?
Enns' book is a fascinating one, which varies between sort of, I think, very helpful sort of summaries of ancient Near Eastern culture, and then rather blunt statements like, it didn't happen that way, it never happened, God didn't command it. And that's my problem with Enns' book, that because he's trying to speak on a popular level, but he goes too far in sort of saying, it didn't happen, God didn't command it, and then he's moving down the line of kind of, well, he doesn't say this, I think he would not want to say this, but it's getting too close to me to the line that many people take nowadays of Moses and Joshua got it wrong. They misunderstood what God was saying. God wouldn't have said that. And because he hasn't clearly differentiated in that case, I don't find that such a helpful approach. Because you then run all kinds of problems with biblical authority. If you're saying, what is said in the Bible to be God saying it isn't actually that at all, and Moses and Joshua got it wrong, then you're raising all kinds of problems. And where do you stop? I don't like this bit, therefore, this can't be God either. So that's my concern with Enns. I think some really good stuff in there, but he jumps too quickly to a kind of oversimplistic response as a result. Any other questions on?
Thank you for your lectures. It's good to hear about the Canaanites. I approach the Old Testament as a Christian, In other words, I take seriously the fact that Christ interpreted the Old Testament.
Yes.
I cannot imagine Christ approving of slaughtering all the Amalekites.
Mm-hmm.
I find it impossible to believe that God actually promoted war. I can understand God can work in war situations,
Mm-hmm.
but I do not believe that God ever promoted war and wanted the killing of so many people.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that your conclusion, the requirement of loyalty to God, whatever it takes,
Yeah.
has to be severely qualified.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not whatever I think it takes, it's whatever Jesus Christ thinks it takes,
Yes.
or whatever God thinks it takes.
Yes, indeed.
I
Thank you.
still think there's a real question. Does God approve, initiate, result in war? Is that what we're expected to believe as Christians?
Well, thank you. I mean, and that is part of the struggle that many Christians have. They sort of look at the New Testament and say the portrayal of Jesus, who gave himself for us in self-sacrificial love, seems to be miles apart from this. And therefore, and the question is then, what do you do with these Old Testament texts? So Marcion, back in the first century, said it's a different God. Get rid of it out of the Bible. It's wrong. Now the church disagreed with him then, and has kept the text. Ever since then, Christians have been sort of one sort of easy way out of it is to say, basically forget them, don't rip them out, but pretend they're not there, or to totally spiritualize them and say it's all about just internal battles. I mean, the interesting point that most people are on both sides is Jesus didn't say anything about this, either to commend it or to condemn it. These are his scriptures that he quotes and he affirms, and he in no way seems to diminish or relativize. I mean, he sharpens them in some places. You've heard it said this, I say that. So the question back is, what do we do as Christians? Yes, absolutely, I agree. It's not simply whatever I think it takes. This is the Bible sort of saying whatever it takes, and we have to read that within a Christian frame of reference. And Jesus' commands about turning the other cheek and basically giving ourselves up, loving our enemies and so forth, are a powerful part of reading this in wider biblical context. Jesus also talks about struggling and fighting in a sense of putting ourselves on the line. So I'm not, again, to do the monkey see, monkey do, we should go and kill people because they did. This is a one-off event. It's portrayed as a one-off event, so it's not meant to be a license to do that. It's still difficult. I'm not saying this solves all the problems. I'm sure this is one way to read this as part of Scripture. If all Scripture is useful, then how is this useful to us nowadays? Thank you. Other questions?
Does modern day Israel use the Canaanite argument for the possession of the land?
Does modern day Israel use the Canaanite argument? I think in some cases. I mean, certainly the concept of the promise of the land. There's the big issue of God gave us the land, God's promises are irrevocable, therefore, even though it took 2,000 years for us to get back here, the land is ours. And that overrules any questions of justice. Palestinians say, what about justice? You're not acting justice. God's promises is God's justice. It goes beyond that. Now, they're not, as far as I'm aware, even the most radical settlers, well, at least the ones I've come across, no one is actually calling for an extermination of the Palestinians, but are driving out in some cases, or certainly a control. Obviously, control is the key thing. Control of the West Bank are the more extreme ones. I mean, I know Netanyahu apparently once, wrote "Remember Amalek." So Amalek, the one of Psalms 15 passage, is sort of the dangers. So again, it can be a call for radical behaviour. In the same way that these passages have been used, or rather misused, I would say, by Christians throughout the ages to justify empire, colonialism, conquest. So there are dangers about how they can be used. Certainly, these are dangerous passages, and that's why we have to interpret them carefully. But rather than ignoring them, I would say the response to a bad interpretation is to promote a better one. Rather than saying we don't touch them at all, to say how do we read them better? And that's the struggle here. Any other questions?
A few questions.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little bit more on the verbally. I'd like to know when you're listening to verbally and when you're denying the truth of what you're reading.
Yes. Yes.
But I can see there is room for that. And obviously, there's a whole lecture inside there about genre and so on.
Yes.
That's one question. Another is more on the ethical and theological. What about pacifism? I mean, our brother here in saying that Jesus would never promote war. Is that a denial of any just war?
So the first point about hyperbole, simple answer is, obviously, if you're looking at something that can't be right, then we can look it up and try and find out, because we don't just interpret the Bible sitting and reading it on our own we interpret it in community, which involves also, the likes of, that's what some of us are useful for, hopefully, and ministers and other people say, what does this mean? Do I take this literally, rather than having to decide it on the spot? We look it up in commentary, see what people have said, see what otherwise people think about it. And yes, avoid the kind of, on the one hand, I don't like this, therefore it must be metaphorical kind of answer. That's dangerous. That's kind of whatever I want interpretation. On the other hand, we don't just read it and say literally, crudely, it says it literally, so I have to follow it literally, because no one does that. So it's exercising wisdom in interpretation, and not just ourselves, but in a wider community. Pacifism and hell, how long have I got? Not long enough. These are issues, these are issues that people have grappled with in looking at the Bible. The Old Testament, that's a record of a nation living amongst other nations, Jesus' radical messages, how we put all this together. And then when you had the just war came about sort of Christian Europe, when you have Christian princes saying, how do I defend my people and my country? Do I just give in and let the barbarians attack and wipe out Christian Europe, or how do I acceptably attack? And sort of a compromise. Just war is really, isn't it? So, hell, well, again, understanding the biblical passage well. So I can sidestep this one. There's a couple of useful chapters in here on this, on the end times judgment, all this sort of stuff. On the one hand, maybe go back to what I'm saying, you don't just condemn and say, well, they're going to hell. That's the kind of bad Canaanites kind of approach. We don't dare do that. On the other hand, to say there is no justice after this life, that, whatever you do in this life doesn't matter, you're all going to get something nice anyway, is an utter disincentive to any kind of right behaviour. God is not just at all then. God's justice and mercy have to be held in tension. And only God knows, in any case, what is going to happen to any individual. We can just be faithful to the general message that he's given us. Message here.
Seem a rather unusual question, but the Canaanites, if God kills the Canaanites in this world, almost us as possible unjustly in some ways, does God show them mercy in the next life? We assume that they killed the Canaanites and just go to hell. That's probably almost a good assumption. Is that right?
The honest answer is we don't know. The Old Testament speaks very, very little about life after death. It says almost nothing about it. We understand it from the New Testament. And then there's the wider questions, the wider questions about the Canaanites, those who never heard. It all factors into how is God just if people could never have. So one thing I'm trying to do here is saying it's not just the Canaanites are sort of doomed as a race without any chance. Those who wanted to respond, at least in adult terms, could do so. So there is not quite that crude. How God will deal with them is beyond my... I do not dare to say what God will do. I simply say that I believe in a God who is just and merciful, and he will determine in every case what happens to them. So that's ducking it in a sense, but I think I can legitimately duck what will happen, what will happen to the Canaanites. Exactly the same, but what will happen to anybody? It's up to God. Any other questions? Any last question, last one or two? Anyone? No, then we will take a break. Thank you for your attention. Time for coffee and scones.